In the early hours of a dry season morning in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré signed a document that would ignite a firestorm across continents. It was not a treaty nor a war declaration. It was a demolition order targeting 100 mosques across Burkina Faso, not for military reasons, not as an act of religious persecution, but to make way for a university that, in his words, would outlast every stone ever laid in the name of symbolic faith. The move stunned the world. Saudi Arabia called it a grave offense to Islamic heritage. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation demanded immediate clarification. Washington, caught between supporting religious freedom and backing African sovereignty, issued a diplomatically convoluted statement that pleased no one. France, once colonial ruler of Burkina Faso, condemned the act as dangerously revisionist. On the streets of Europe, African diaspora communities split sharply. Some burned Traoré's effigy. Others raised his image alongside Sankara's. But to understand the decision, one must go back to the summit that took place 14 months earlier in Algiers. The setting, a gilded palace conference room filled with North African and Gulf diplomats. On the agenda, expanding Arab-African religious infrastructure cooperation. The subtext, exporting influence through faith. When the Saudi delegation offered Traoré funding for 200 new mosques, framed as a spiritual revival package, he listened quietly. Then he declined. Not politely, not ambiguously. He simply said, "I don't need more places to kneel. I need places to stand." It wasn't just a refusal, it was a rupture. The 100 mosques now marked for demolition were not empty relics. Many were active community hubs woven into the daily rhythm of life. But Traoré saw something else. He saw spaces that, in his view, had long replaced curiosity with compliance. In private memos later leaked by internal whistleblowers, he wrote, "We've taught our children to fear hell but not to question gravity. We've raised generations who can recite scripture but cannot code. This is not piety. This is paralysis." In the capital, the reaction was swift. Clerics called for calm. Opposition politicians called for impeachment. Yet, construction fences began rising. Bulldozers arrived, and in their place, a strange structure began to emerge. Circular, stark, almost alien to the city's colonial grid. It would be called the Université Libre Africaine, or the ULA. Not just a school, but what Traoré's chief architect referred to as, an intellectual defense system. Traoré had quietly assembled a team of visionaries from across the continent. At the core, Professor Seifou Makonda, a Tanzanian mathematician and former MIT dropout who once designed neural simulations for IBM's quantum division before vanishing from public view. Alongside him, Dr. Lamia Fadel, a Sudanese architect known for climate-adaptive design in desert cities. And from Senegal, Alassane Ndiaye, a data governance activist who helped design the first decentralized national ID system in West Africa. Their shared belief, Africa's sovereignty would not be won through territory or weapons, but through curriculum. ULA was planned to be more than a university. It would be a factory of ideas. Its curriculum bypassed Western accreditation boards and instead followed a modular pan-African design based on real-world application, indigenous epistemology, and sovereign tech protocols. Courses were delivered in a mix of local languages, French, and Swahili. AI development was taught alongside oral history. Civil engineering included studies of pre-colonial irrigation networks and modern solar grid systems. Philosophy classes debated Confucius and Diop in the same breath. And yet, the international backlash only grew. CNN aired a week-long special titled "The War on Worship," painting Traoré's decision as authoritarian populism. The Vatican issued a rare statement warning against the erasure of sacred community spaces. Saudi clerics denounced him in Friday sermons broadcast across the Muslim world. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department froze $80 million in educational assistance and called for dialogue on religious tolerance. But Traoré remained unmoved. "We've tolerated ignorance long enough," he said in a speech delivered not from a palace but from a scaffolding platform inside the university's half-built library dome. "Let me be clear. I am not against faith. I am against imported obedience that leaves us barefoot in laboratories of the soul. The speech went viral across Africa. In Kenya, students organized viewing parties. In Nigeria, hashtags like #SchoolsOverSymbols trended for days. In South Africa, an op-ed declared, "If this is heresy, let it spread." For once, Burkina Faso was not on the global news for famine, coups, or war. It was for an idea. The next move came from the United Nations. Citing concerns over heritage destruction, UNESCO threatened to strip Burkina Faso of its World Heritage designations. In retaliation, Traoré's government withdrew from all UNESCO partnerships. Then came the surprise. Mali, Chad, and the Central African Republic followed suit. Quietly, but deliberately. This was no longer just about mosques or one university. It had become a fault line in a much larger battle, the future of African self-determination. And in this new landscape, ULA was becoming the prototype. Its enrollment policy favored students from conflict zones, disenfranchised rural areas, and underrepresented ethnic groups. Its admissions test measured not IQ, but creative resilience, a metric designed to reward lateral thinking, systems fluency, and emotional intelligence. The school rejected donations from all foreign governments, NGOs, and religious bodies. It was funded through a sovereign trust backed by mining revenues, tax on telecoms, and a new digital currency nicknamed Lumumba, tradable only within a select block of African economies. As ULA's first semester approached, another shockwave hit. France issued sanctions on several Burkina Faso ministers. The European Union began debating whether to suspend trade privileges, but inside Africa, the opposite was unfolding. Delegations from Ethiopia, Rwanda, and even traditionally West-aligned Ghana began arriving in Ouagadougou. They did not bring aid. They brought notebooks. They came not to advise, but to learn. Ministers, university rectors, urban developers, even opposition leaders, many of them skeptics, months earlier, now sat inside ULA's unfinished amphitheater, listening to lectures on modular education systems, renewable campus design, and indigenous innovation. What they saw wasn't a campus, it was a model. One of them whispered, as picked up by a hot mic later leaked online, This is what they feared. Not our weapons, our minds. But not everyone was inspired. By the time ULA held its silent inauguration, no ribbon cutting, no fanfare, just the quiet unlocking of doors for its first 1,200 students, coordinated media attacks began flooding in. French-language newspapers across West Africa, funded quietly by European endowments, accused the school of being a radicalization center. One viral editorial described it as a breeding ground for techno-nationalist ideology disguised as academic rigor. Washington escalated its position. The U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing titled Faith Under Siege, Africa's New Strongmen and the Erosion of Religious Freedom. Witnesses included former USAID officials, human rights activists, and think tank operatives who had never set foot in Burkina Faso. One senator called Traoré's government the most dangerous ideological export since Chavez. Back in Ouagadougou, students were busy building solar dehydration chambers for rural food storage. One of the more remarkable stories came from a young Fulani girl named Sarata Diomande, who at age 16 had walked 4 days from her village to attend the university's open trial assessment. She had never touched a computer. Within 3 months, she had co-developed an AI prototype to predict cross-border cattle migration patterns, reducing farmer-herder conflicts. Her model was already being tested in northern Benin. But international pressure continued to mount. Saudi Arabia quietly revoked travel visas for Burkinabe government officials. The UAE froze asset transfers. A coordinated cyber attack hit several of the country's government servers. An act later linked to a London-based private cybersecurity firm with ties to former French intelligence operatives. Yet ULA remained untouched. Its entire data infrastructure was offline by design. No cloud, Dr. Fidel had said bluntly. Our knowledge is not for sale. And in a final move that stunned even longtime allies, Captain Traoré announced that all national civil service exams would now require 1 semester of study or contribution to the ULA system, either as a student, a guest mentor, or a project partner. Overnight, thousands of bureaucrats, soldiers, and judges found themselves attending late-night lectures, many in open-air classrooms lit only by solar lanterns. It wasn't humiliation, it was recalibration. The signal was clear. Intelligence was now the highest currency of statecraft. And then came the moment that turned ULA from a national marvel into a continental phenomenon. In late 2031, 6 nations, Senegal, Guinea, Mali, Chad, Niger, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, announced the formation of the Pan-African Education Accord, modeled on ULA's principles. It was the first time in modern African history that education, not trade, not defense, not aid, was used as the founding stone of a regional alliance. Even more radical, the accord included a clause rejecting all education-related funding from former colonial powers unless co-managed by local knowledge commissions. In one sentence, they had rewritten the rules of partnership. The West was furious, but it was too late. ULA's blueprint had already been copied, physically and digitally. Open-source documents detailing its governance model, modular design, pedagogical theory, and data ethics framework were now hosted in dozens of nodes across the continent. Traoré had never tried to trademark his revolution. He had offered it as a gift, one the world never saw coming. And still, the mosques haunted the narrative. A BBC documentary aired titled Ashes of Faith, juxtaposing drone shots of the demolished mosque sites with interviews of grieving elders. The narrative was simple. Traoré had traded soul for science. But inside Africa, the story was more complex. One of the elders interviewed by the BBC, whose words were selectively edited, later released his full, untranslated statement. I mourn the mosque not because it is gone, but because for decades it stood while our children starved. If we must give one house to build 100 mines, I say it is not a loss, it is a tithe. The video went viral, and in that moment, the very foundation of the Western development model cracked. Because it wasn't just Traoré anymore. It was the schoolgirls in Burkina Faso coding in Moray. It was the youth in Niger rebuilding abandoned classrooms. It was the ministers in Ghana quietly rewriting procurement laws to favor local lab equipment makers. It was the grandmothers in Togo forming kitchen cooperatives to feed night students. This wasn't just a policy shift, it was a civilizational pivot. And as the world scrambled to analyze, counter, or copy the Burkina Faso model, one truth emerged, sharp, undeniable, and humbling. When you trade places of worship for places of wisdom, you don't destroy faith, you redefine it. By mid-2032, the world had changed more than anyone was prepared to admit. Burkina Faso, once synonymous with instability and obscurity, was now setting the philosophical tone for a continent in motion. Its story was no longer seen through the lens of crisis, but as a case study in strategic courage. Traoré had not just overturned an offer of 200 mosques, he had overturned an entire logic of development. The shift was not just structural or economic, it was psychological. Young Africans across the continent were no longer asking for scholarships abroad. They were asking how to build another ULA. Educational exchange programs between West African countries surged. The phrase, made in Africa, taught in Africa, designed for Africa, became a tagline stamped on textbooks, software, even 3D printed prosthetics created in ULA's biomedical lab. In Lagos, muralists began painting scenes of Burkina-based students teaching quantum physics under trees. In Kigali, policy institutes held symposiums titled The ULA Doctrine. But while the continent celebrated, old power centers plotted. The IMF began restructuring loan packages for Francophone countries, tying debt relief to religious harmony initiatives. The World Bank quietly inserted clauses into education grants requiring adherence to international cultural integration frameworks. In other words, funding would now be used to penalize ideological divergence. But Traoré saw it coming. Months earlier, he had begun quietly building a Pan-African digital currency fund, the Kuji Tegemea Reserve, Swahili for self-reliance, backed not by Western banks, but by a coalition of mining exports, agriculture futures, and intellectual property rights. Countries contributing to the fund received access to pooled research grants, sovereign digital tools, and the ULA curriculum translated into local languages. The vision was simple. If you could protect your education system, you could protect your sovereignty. Yet as the stakes rose, so did the dangers. In July 2032, a massive cyber attack struck the fiber optic backbone connecting ULA's regional satellite campuses. Simultaneously, social media across West Africa was flooded with rumors, fabricated images of destroyed mosques, faked reports of religious purges, and audio deepfakes imitating Traoré insulting Islamic traditions. The goal was clear, to fracture the movement from within. But they underestimated the new generation. Within hours, ULA-trained digital forensic teams traced the attacks to shell companies in Geneva and Singapore. A documentary exposé, The Wires Beneath the Aid, aired within 48 hours, naming names, revealing contracts, and exposing the quiet cyber-colonial machinery that had long operated without scrutiny. The public reaction was volcanic. Mass protests erupted, not in Burkina Faso, but in Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and Cameroon. People weren't burning flags or embassies. They were demanding digital sovereignty, they were demanding schools, and they were holding their own leaders accountable. Within weeks, 3 ministers across different countries resigned. In Sierra Leone, students occupied a foreign-funded education ministry until it agreed to integrate ULA's modular curriculum. In Chad, a group of retired imams released a statement declaring, "Faith must guide our hearts, but knowledge must build our future." Traoré is not the enemy of Islam. He is the enemy of ignorance. The tide had turned. And yet, through it all, Traoré remained silent. He gave no interviews. He issued no grand declarations. Instead, he returned to ULA, now fully operational, its dorms full, its laboratories buzzing. He walked the corridors without entourage, sat in on lectures, reviewed blueprints for a new campus in Bobo Dioulasso focused entirely on agricultural innovation. His advisors warned him of escalating threats. He simply nodded and replied, "They are not afraid of me. They are afraid of an Africa that reads." Then came the final chapter. In October 2032, Burkina Faso hosted the first Pan-African Education Sovereignty Summit. 38 nations attended. Not a single Western delegation was invited. The summit produced the Ouagadougou Declaration, a binding agreement that committed signatories to allocate a minimum of 10% of national budgets to education infrastructure by 2035. Phase out all curriculum programs designed or approved by foreign NGOs within 5 years. Establish inter-African knowledge exchange platforms with no Western intermediaries. Recognize access to indigenous sovereign education as a constitutional right. No aid. No debt, just design. When asked by local journalists if he felt vindicated, Traoré smiled, the first time caught on camera in weeks, and said, "I didn't need to be right. I needed to prove we could choose." And perhaps that is the true legacy of the 100 demolished mosques, not as acts of desecration, but as moments of decision. Moments where a nation said, "We will build cathedrals of the mind before we kneel in imported sanctuaries." Moments where a people chose their children over foreign approval. Today, the mosques are gone. But in their place stands something unshakable. A movement, a memory, and a message. Africa is not waiting anymore. It is building. And the blueprint began here. With a man, a decision, and a classroom.